Hello, and welcome to Becoming, Leadership Stories for the Middle. My name is Benjamin Potter, and I am currently a campus leader at an independent school in Queensland, and I will be your host for this series. Over the last 7 years, I have held a variety of middle leadership roles within schools both here in Australia and internationally in England. I have well and truly traversed the challenges and pitfalls of middle leadership within school environments, and am on a journey to engage with senior leaders from across the world to hear how they journeyed through the middle on their leadership journeys. I'm going to ask the questions we as middle leaders want to know from those who have successfully walked these paths and made it into the highest levels of school leadership. That being said, this podcast is not just for middle leaders. This podcast is for all teachers who have aspirations of stepping into leadership within their schools. This podcast will aim to hear the lived experience of highly capable and successful leaders through their journey. I will be asking about the early steps, the doubts, the mentors, the mistakes, and the moments that shaped who they became long before they stepped into principalship. Across the world, there are extraordinary leaders doing extraordinary work. But behind every respected principal or head of school is a story of becoming. There are countless leadership programs, podcasts, and conversations out in the ether that talk about leadership. Yet so much of that content focuses on those already in senior roles. We hear from principals, CEOs, head teachers, and system leaders who talk about what they are doing now at the top and what leading at the top is like. And these insights are deeply valuable. But for many emerging leaders, these stories can feel distant. What's missing is the middle, the messy, formative, very human middle. This podcast hopes to fill that gap. Each episode invites a seasoned school leader to look back, not at their time as a principal or a head, but at the journey that led them there, the early decisions, the unexpected opportunities, the challenges that shaped them, the people who believed in them, and the moments that changed everything. It's a leadership development through storytelling, grounded, honest, and deeply relatable. If you're listening to this, you might be a middle leader, an aspiring leader, or a teacher who feels that pull towards something more. Maybe you've just stepped into your first leadership role. Maybe you're considering applying for one. Maybe you're wondering if you're ready at all. Wherever you are, I want you to hear this clearly. Every leader you admire has stood exactly where you're standing. They felt unsure, they've questioned themselves, they've wondered whether they were capable, credible, or ready, and that's why this podcast exists, to make the journey visible and to remind you that leadership isn't a title, it's a becoming. I hope you will join me on this journey. Please subscribe to my channels and follow along for many insightful conversations. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Becoming. I am delighted to welcome you all to this podcast series. Today, my first ever guest is a previous headmaster of mine who actually gave me my first ongoing middle leadership position, Robert Teague. Welcome, Robert. It is a privilege to have you as my first guest.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I really appreciate your time. I know it's early in England at the moment. Before I begin asking all my questions, I just wanted to share with our listeners a little bit about who you are and your background. You weren't always destined to be a teacher, often neglecting studies in favour of working in your early years. You moved into working onto a building site and eventually worked as a police officer in London, which I'm sure could be the basis of a whole other podcast. But you ended up finding your love for academic learning, especially through maths. From there, you studied a mathematics degree, which led you into the wonderful world of teaching. You were appointed the head of maths at Magdalen College School, Oxford, then became a senior leader at a grammar school in South London, moved on to be the founding head of an independent Catholic boys' school, and are now the head of another Catholic boys' school in South London. Not a man to rest while you're working, you have also completed a master's degree in pure maths and educational leadership, co-wrote the specifications for the Cambridge Pre-U in mathematics and further mathematics, worked as a school inspector with ISI, and have spent time in the Army Reserves. Thank you so much for being my first guest, Robert.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, as I alluded to earlier, you began your career as a middle leader as the head of maths. I was wondering if you would be happy just to talk us through that role and what it was like stepping into that first position.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting position because the school I was at was a very high-performing school with very good staff. And I was encouraged to apply for the role when it came up. I just started at the school, been there a couple of months, and it hadn't occurred to me to apply, to be perfectly honest. And so to my surprise, I got the role and found myself in a department where virtually everybody was far better qualified than I was. And some of them had very senior roles in the school as well. So it was an unusual challenge.
Mm.
I learned some useful things from it, but I think also there were elements of middle leadership that were perhaps lacking in
Hmm.
that role.
Yeah.
And then I noticed the lack of those elements further on in my career.
Yeah.
But I think, from my point of view, it underlines um, how important context is to any role. Ultimately, every school is different. Every department is different to some extent. One has to adapt to the situation
Yeah.
one finds oneself in.
So how did you navigate that? Because I noticed that even when I stepped into middle leadership, there are times where you are potentially leading people who are, as you said, more experienced or potentially older than you, or maybe even better qualified than you. How did you find yourself navigating that? Did you get pushback from anybody in that department, or were they quite welcoming of you being the head?
They were quite supportive.
Yeah, that's
I
good.
mean, it required a bit of diplomacy. I think if I'd gone in like a bull in a china shop, it wouldn't have gone down
Yeah.
well.
Yes.
And also, I mean, I do see leadership as a service fundamentally. And I think that
Mm.
in a way, it's easier to see it in that way if you're thinking, well, actually, all these people are really, they're probably better teachers than I am.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so my role is to facilitate what they're doing to enable them to be their best selves. And I think, the most important thing I learned during that role, because I was fortunate to get the job at that school, and at the time the head was Andrew Halls, who's recently retired, but he's certainly known as one of the great heads really in certainly in this country. And when he more or less coached me through the role at the beginning,
Mm.
and he gave me a vision of leadership, which I assumed at the time was perfectly normal and mainstream, but I've subsequently found out that actually it's quite idiosyncratic, but I like it and it's always
Okay.
stayed with me. And the way he framed the job of the leader was to enable everybody to be the best person they can, to be the best version of themselves, to try and know them well, to understand what makes them tick and to tap into their strengths and enthusiasms. And so going into that situation, that was a useful way to perceive things.
Mm.
Um, so I saw myself very much as I say, trying to smooth the path for them to be
Yeah.
great. But as I say, the flip side of that was that there were things lacking in my formation as a leader, which
Yeah.
which I would encounter later on
Yeah.
in
Would you
other
mind
contexts
sharing
that were
what some
quite
of those
different.
were? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think one thing that I suppose the first home truth I was told as a leader, and it came about through a 360-degree appraisal, was that I wasn't holding people to account enough. And when I heard that, I thought, well, actually, I mean, no one likes to be criticised, but
Yeah.
I thought actually that's probably quite true.
Yeah.
And it was partly because I've been in a situation where that wasn't the main concern, because all the people I was working with were fantastic, and
Mm.
and so there were the odd things to point out, but it wasn't really a question of um, accountability. So then
Yeah.
in other roles, I had to adjust to that.
Mhm.
And also, I suppose, to recognize my own, I was going to say character weaknesses. I mean, I think our character weaknesses are often our character strengths.
Mhm.
They're the flip side. And some of the things that work well for us have in other situations can become problematic.
Yeah.
And so I think that self-awareness is really important as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. It's something that I've tried to work on, is being aware of where I may be falling down
Yeah,
and
yeah.
work on that, rather than being resistant to maybe growing in certain areas. But what you're talking about with feedback, or holding other people to account, I think that's something that when you step into middle leadership, it is quite a scary thing to do, is to
Mm.
maybe go to a colleague, sort of deliver them feedback about the way that they're going about their work. That's a quite intimidating thing. How did you maybe conquer that? How did you work out how to do that? Were there any pitfalls where you did it badly and it didn't go well, or did you work in a skill in that space?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely made lots of mistakes. And some of my earliest encounters, I still cringe when I think of them, where I approached being ill prepared or just
Yeah.
taking the wrong tack with a
Mm.
situation like that. But I think one of the most important things is that self awareness, and first of all, being conscious of those weaknesses. So, for example, if you're somebody who likes to be liked, as I think probably
Mm.
most of us do, it's good to be aware of that, because then you think, okay, well, that's why I find this difficult, because I don't really want somebody to not like me.
Yeah.
But equally, I've got to do the right thing. I've got other. You're
Yeah.
trying to balance responsibilities to different constituencies, um, and I think in terms of difficult conversations themselves. I mean, one of the most useful models I've found is radical candor, which you might have come
Hmm.
across.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, and I think that is a good way of it offers a good way of approaching a difficult conversation. And I
Mm.
think the other things I've picked up along the way is, first of all, to prepare meticulously, but normally to have a very short conversation.
Yeah.
Um, for several reasons. I think, and not least because if the conversation goes on too long, then
Mm.
often the most important messages get lost.
Yeah.
And so I think if the conversation is short, it can still be very empathetic and everything else,
Yeah.
but at least then the the purpose of the conversation is clear, and
Yeah.
hopefully the other person goes away with something helpful,
Yeah.
um, and well understood.
Yeah. And is there any other prep work that you would recommend? Or I've heard some theories about don't do it at the start of the day because then they have to dwell on it for the rest of the day. Only do it sort of just before they go home. And then other people say, well, don't do it just before they go home because then they'll weigh on it all night. And it seems like there's sort of that
Mm,
contradictory viewpoints around when is the best time to give
mm,
feedback, especially in that middle leadership position where potentially as a head, I don't know if this is different or not, you're sort of holding a very senior position. So when you hold someone to feedback, it can come from maybe a higher weight of authority.
mm.
Did you find there was any strategy in that space, or was it, as you said, maybe just needing to get to know the person and
Yeah, I mean,
what's
I've heard
best
both
suited a
those.
person?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard both those theories, and,
Yeah.
and I've ignored them both, to be honest.
Okay.
Well, because I just don't know. Because
Yeah.
I think in an extreme case, I would
Mm.
probably go for the end of the day, but that would
Yeah.
only be if there was something that was likely to be very um, upsetting for somebody. And
Yeah.
I think then it's almost a matter of common sense, really, that you're not going to
Yes.
start somebody's day in that way.
Yeah. Or send them into a classroom
You
upset.
might go, oh, or you might want to send them home after that. But I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
but those would be extreme cases. But I think if you like the normal difficult conversations, I wouldn't. There are
Hmm.
arguments both ways, and it probably depends to some extent on the individual as well. And it's very difficult to know
Yeah.
how a particular individual is going to react.
Mm.
I suppose one thing I've always found as well is that apart from the natural discomfort of not wanting to say something that somebody doesn't want to hear, which I think is normal to most of us.
Mm.
Um, if I feel really uncomfortable about saying something that's going against my instincts, I would normally hold fire, because I
Mm.
found that often those feelings are grounded in something solid, and it's a
Hmm.
question of identifying. And perhaps there is something wrong. Perhaps there's something that needs thinking through more.
Yeah.
But I've had a couple of occasions where, because a decision's been made, and I felt it's gone against my instincts, but I've gone ahead with it, and I've normally regretted it,
Yeah.
because often those instincts turned out to be right in a way that I couldn't name or identify at the time, but
Mm.
became clear afterwards.
Yeah.
Of course, what's
Did you
been
ever?
said can't be unsaid, so
Yes. Yes.
it needs preparation.
Yeah. Did you ever find that you faced that as a middle leader where potentially the school was taking a position and you were needing to outwork a position that your instincts were potentially screaming at you, or there was an uncomfortableness in that, but yet you've got the, you've been asked by your leaders to do something, and therefore,
Mm.
unless it's sort of morally reprehensible, it's part of your job to go ahead and do it. How do you navigate those situations? Or did you have to navigate those situations?
I didn't have that as a middle leader, to be perfectly honest. I think
Okay.
that was partly because I was quite strongly aligned
Mhm.
with the school when I was a middle leader.
Yeah.
And also perhaps because a lot of my ideas weren't fully formed. I
Yeah.
was that they were forming at the time.
Hmm.
I have had situations like that later on
Yeah.
where um, I've disagreed with the approach taken,
Yeah.
I mean, not too often, to be perfectly honest,
Yeah.
but where I've had to own a decision,
Mhm.
and it's certainly a mistake I've seen in some middle leaders where perhaps they don't own that decision,
Yeah.
and it can be very undermining, most of all for them,
Mm.
as well as for the school as a whole. So
Yeah, I was going to say that you can, as a middle leader, is that something to try and avoid? Is that, well, the school has said, and
yeah,
therefore I have to, and that sort of, because that sort of led me to one of my other questions, which was
mm,
sometimes as a middle leader, there feels like that pull and that tension, allegiance, for a lack of a better word, between
mm,
potentially senior leadership and maybe the staff room that are frustrated about something, and you
yeah,
want to obviously make sure that you're doing what you've been asked to by your senior leaders, but you're also
mm,
trying to make sure that you're keeping staff on side. And there's sometimes you feel pulled. You
mm.
know, is the worst mistake you can do is to sort of agree with senior leadership over here, but then agree with the staff over here, and then sort of play the middle. Is that from your perspective something that can get you into a bit of? And how do you navigate that successfully?
Yeah. I mean, it is a difficult situation. It's not straightforward.
Mm,
Um, and I think to some extent it does depend
hmm.
on the situation. But I think that, and I suppose I'm seeing this from a senior leader viewpoint at the moment, and perhaps that colours my perspective.
Sure.
But um, I do think that where a middle leader, if you like, distances themselves from a decision that they've got to implement,
Mm,
um, it really does. Um, I think ultimately it damages their position to some extent,
okay. Yeah.
because and I think also it undermines the school.
Mm,
Um, I mean,
yeah.
again, it must depend to some extent on the um, the exact situation, but um, I would always say that where as a middle leader, where you're unhappy with something, then that should be voiced.
Hmm.
Because I think everybody in a school has a different perspective and sees different sides of school
Yeah.
life, and it could be that actually the decision is wrong. But I think once the decision's made, um, I don't think any good comes out of people distancing from it, or
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you're almost better off with a consistent decision, which may not be the best decision, rather than
Yeah.
a situation where middle leaders are almost pitting themselves against senior leaders,
Yes.
and aligning with staff, which I think causes more damage in the long term
Yeah.
to the harmony of the school, and, as I say, to the individuals involved. That's my view.
Yeah. So it just sort of feeling from two different perspectives. It sounds like you've had it in your career, which is being a middle leader in a school where you feel aligned with the direction and the ethos of the school is obviously vitally important, because then you are going to actually hopefully avoid some of these pitfalls where you may not find yourself so totally against what senior
Mm,
leadership is asking for. But then secondly, advice I've been given, and I'm interested to hear what you think about this, is that you've got to learn the leader where to complain and how to complain,
mm, mm,
and always to almost complain upwards. Don't go to the staff room and say, "Oh, I don't like this decision." You maybe go to the senior leadership and respectfully say, "I'm concerned about this decision," or "I'm thinking about that." Would you agree with that statement of focus?
absolutely, I would agree with that 100%. And I think
Mm,
that um, I feel in the school, people do have a duty almost to speak up,
hmm.
and to, in the right channels, because
Yeah.
because of what I said earlier, that nobody sees everything. I
Mm,
mean, some people might have more of an overview, but actually
yeah.
they're going to have less of a detailed picture as well,
Yes.
and there may be things that they haven't seen or taken account of. So I think that in a school, whatever your role, if there's something that you think is um, not the best, it's worth
Mm,
raising that. But as you say, with the appropriate people, I think grumbling in the staff room never does any good to a school. Um,
yes. Yeah.
so so yeah, no, I'd agree with that completely.
Yeah. I heard another way someone phrased it once was that we're all in our own bubbles, in a sense. So a classroom teacher, they're thinking about the bubble of their classroom. If you're the head of a department, you're thinking about the bubble of your department, and so on and so forth. It gets bigger and bigger until you're the head and you're thinking about the entire school. And to be a leader, especially in middle leadership, you've got to think beyond your bubble to start to understand how maybe the head is thinking about it. Do you find that that's a skill? Did you have to learn that skill? Did you naturally find yourself thinking about the bigger picture, or was that something that through conversations with leaders you had to go, oh, okay, I've got to start to train myself to think beyond what I see? Do you think there's something in that?
Yeah, I think it is something which develops because, again, I think it's a matter of adapting to what your area of focus should be.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that does change from role to role. And generally, I think as you move into senior leadership, you do need to delegate more.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, some people don't like delegating, or perhaps they're not used to delegating. And so I think that's something, again, which people have to adapt to,
Mm-hmm.
and to learn to delegate well. Yeah. I think also taking responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
because and that's certainly something I found that,
Yeah.
I remember at one point in my career, inwardly moaning about something and thinking, oh, that really isn't very good at all. And then
Yeah.
it dawning on me that actually if it wasn't that good, that's down to me. I'm the person who should actually do something about it. So
Yeah.
instead of moaning, I should crack on and do what needs
Yeah.
to be done. But so I think that there's certainly that I suppose evolution of perspective that
Yeah.
happens, but I think it's very difficult to prepare completely for it, because I think it's something which you then develop in that role as your perspective changes.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you've just got to be continuously open to learn if you want
Yeah,
to
I think
make
so.
it
Yeah,
through. If you've made it to the middle, and that's great, and people see that there's some capacity within you, and that's great. But if you think you've made it, or you've got everything sorted, you're probably not going to be able to move out of the middle,
yeah,
because you've got to
yeah,
stay. I guess that's probably also the encouragement to those who are not maybe necessarily in a leadership position and are trying to figure out, do they want to get into leadership, and they're struggling with that. It's remain open to learning, show that you're keen
yeah,
to
yeah,
have
yeah,
your
yeah,
perspective challenged. Yeah, that's a really
yeah.
good point. Moving to a slightly different tone, did you find that stepping into middle leadership, I know you said in your first school, it was quite a good school and there was a lot of encouragement. Did you ever find that coming in as a leader that maybe relationships changed? That when you stepped into leadership, that people maybe saw you in a different light, treated you in a different light, or were you, again, necessarily didn't have to face too much of that in your career?
There were awkwardnesses,
Okay.
which came partly because I was an internal appointment. I mean, I hadn't been in the school very long. Mm. So suddenly, one day you're alongside people as a colleague, and then the
Yeah.
next thing you're in charge of the department.
Yeah.
But
What were some of those awkwardnesses, if I can ask?
I think, I mean, I've got to be honest, I was quite surprised that I was appointed
Yeah.
the head of department.
Yeah.
And it was a really, really good department with
Yeah.
amazing teachers there,
Yeah.
with very well qualified and very experienced for the most part. Um, and it's funny actually, because I suppose that helped me to see that leadership is actually something a little bit different. It's not about being necessarily the best teacher or the best something
Yeah.
else, but it's about trying to lead as well as possible, and to provide that service to others.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I guess that sort of coming from outside can sometimes be really good, because you can just establish yourself straight away as, this is how I operate as a leader.
yeah,
But as an internal hire, you've gone from sort of, a bit of a crass analogy, sitting next to
yeah,
somebody to then sitting slightly above somebody. And now suddenly
yeah,
you have to make the final call on a decision. How did you navigate that? Obviously, there's always going to be some
yeah.
pitfalls and things. And
Well, I couldn't reinvent myself,
yes.
as I say, because I was internal. But I think it was just trying to be very tactful.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the important things in any leadership role is to be yourself. I don't know where the phrase comes from, "Be yourself with more skill," but I think there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
And I think if you try and be somebody else, it's never going to work. It's never going to end
Yeah.
well. You have to build on the character that you have, the personality that you have. And so I was, I couldn't become a different person overnight.
Yes.
So I had to be the same person, but just carrying out that different
Mhm.
role. But as I say, I was fortunate in the sense that, I wasn't having to um, immediately, haul people over the coals
Yeah.
in that new role. It wasn't
Yeah.
that type of situation. It was more,
Yeah.
and I suppose as well, the school as a whole
Mm.
was very collegial. They encouraged
Yeah, that's good.
a collegiality, and people
Mhm.
would talk about managerialism in a very negative way.
Yeah.
And it was probably a little bit rooted in the past, because I suspect it may not be the same now. It's probably changed
Yeah.
a little bit. So in a sense, that collegiality made things easier, because I was able
Yeah.
to, I mean, just about everything I could approach. I'd make sure that I asked,
Mhm.
colleagues' opinions on decisions, and made sure that they were heard, um, and valued what they said. Um, and also, again, going back to tapping into people's strengths and interests, tried to find contributions for them to make that they would probably enjoy making, and feel that they were making a contribution that only they could make.
Mm.
So, it might be, in the context of my subject, it might be that they had a particular specialism which nobody else in the department had. So trying to think, well, is there some way that we can harness that for the good of the school?
Yeah.
And then, so things like that, help to keep the atmosphere very positive.
Mhm.
I think if people in that situation, well, I think in any leadership situation, if people feel that they are listened to, that they've got a voice,
Yeah.
that their opinion matters, and that it's recognised that they have a perspective that is unique,
Mhm.
and uh, they have the opportunity to share it. I mean, that really helps to
Yeah.
forge a cohesive department,
Yeah.
and also that
It's
everybody's putting their weight in some way.
yes. Yeah.
So I suppose
It's
not
very
letting
interesting.
people get away with because everybody's
Yeah.
different, and some people
Dragging their
will
feet and
yeah, exactly,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And that's where you talked about how you develop those good conversations of, giving the feedback. And it's
yeah,
interesting the way you're
yeah,
talking. It reminded me, in Australia, we have standards of teaching. And the first standard that we have to show is that students and how they work. It almost
yeah,
sounds like as a middle leader, it's know your team and how they work,
yes,
as
absolutely,
individuals, and
yeah,
what are their strengths and weaknesses. And the more that you do that, the more trust you can build with them.
yes,
And then you can develop yourself. That's interesting
mm,
standpoint. You mentioned, you got to be yourself. And obviously
mm,
that's a phrase that I agree with, in terms of I can't be a different leader. I can't be exactly like yourself, as much as I
yeah.
admire you. That you've got things that I've got that I don't have, and I've
Well,
got to develop
likewise,
my own leadership.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I've often wrestled privately with that phrase, because I've gone, well, what if currently you're quite brash, or you're not a team player, or you're not quite, and then you maybe don't get the leadership role, and you go, well, I'm just being myself. How do you balance that need of, you need to find your unique leadership style, who you are as a person, your makeup, but also, that's what you've talked about already, self-awareness. How do you marry those things together? And then maybe even from your perspective, as now sitting in the headship, someone who's been in middle leadership, who has been resistant to feedback, how do you think you can work through that space?
Well, I think the way I understand be yourself with more skill is you
Mm.
can't do huge violence to your personality. You can't.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think all of us will imitate things we've seen to some extent. We'll imitate,
Hmm.
leaders we've come across, and or perhaps consciously not imitate certain things. We
Yeah.
think, oh, that's good, and actually
Yeah.
that really isn't good. I'm not going to be like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm lucky to have had some really good role models.
Mm.
Um, but I think, but equally, you're absolutely right that we have to change. But I think that be yourself presupposes knowing yourself, and knowing what are the obstacles to you having that more skill, to doing
Yeah.
things more skillfully. Um, so if you don't know what those things are,
Mm.
then it is very difficult to improve.
Yes.
But
So you
I
do
think if
need
you know
someone
what
to
they
point them
are,
out, don't you?
it's possible to correct them, but without
Mm,
fundamentally, trying to be somebody else. It's
yeah.
as I say, going back to um, wanting to be liked.
Mm,
It's something where you can't really change that.
yeah.
You can't become somebody who wants to be hated.
Yes.
Um, but you can, um, once you name it and once you recognize it, you can
Mm,
then see it for what it is, and
yeah.
and which I think just gives perspective, because then you think, okay, well, I'm feeling like this
Mm,
because I don't like saying these things. I don't like these conversations, but I've got to have these conversations. So that's that. And um, uh, so I just had to overcome that. Yeah, I think there's some interesting models of leadership out there. I think the virtuous leadership model is
mm,
quite interesting
yeah.
as a way of, in a way, blushing character,
Yeah.
because I think there's a very deep connection between character and good leadership.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about the virtue approach is that you've always got defect and excess. And I
Mm,
suppose in all of these things, we're somewhere along that spectrum. And again, being able to see where we are often just requires an adjustment to dial something down, or maybe dial it up as,
yeah.
as the need may
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. And understanding how you're perceived is obviously quite important as well,
Yeah.
because I got probably one of the most um, confronting bits of feedback I ever got was that I'd stepped into a leadership role, an internal position, as you talked about. And within only a couple of weeks, I sort of got the feedback that people thought that I'd become maybe a bit big-headed and arrogant now that I'd had a new
Mm,
position. But I didn't think I'd changed
mm,
at all. I thought I was exactly the same as I had been. And so that was really quite confronting to recognize that
yeah.
maybe there was something that I was doing unconsciously that was being perceived as something else, and it quite knocked me for six, and I had to go home and sort of really think things through and go, oh my goodness, and I
Yeah.
guess that's where I fought between those two mindsets of, well, I'm just being me and that's me,
Mm,
and then going, but if that's how I'm perceived, maybe I need to address something. And it doesn't mean I
yes.
have to
Yeah.
change my entire personality, but as you said, maybe I needed to dial something up a bit. And so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
realized I needed to dial up maybe more conversations throughout the day.
Mm, mm,
Get out of my office a bit more. I was trying to do a good job, but I was doing that with my head and my computer and not maybe connecting. So it's fascinating that your body fights against
yeah.
any
Yeah.
kind of feedback, because you sometimes take it as a bit of an attack on yourself.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm,
it's an interesting journey for us to walk through, but it's a good
it
one. And I
is.
think,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very much so.
if you,
Yeah.
yeah, and if you want to go anywhere in leadership, and I'm still in the middle stage, but I've learned that being able to just accept it and take it on board is massive to progress.
Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I know that you've got your stretch for time, so I'll try and not ask you too many questions. But I've just got a couple more than I thought I would like
Okay.
to put at you.
Sure.
Was there ever a moment that you felt ready for the next step, or there was a position that you were really hoping for and you went for and didn't get it? And how did you deal with that? And what sort of advice would you give to maybe people who have felt like that's their journey at leadership at the moment? They've had a couple of cracks at a couple of roles.
Mm,
It's not seemingly happening and they're sort of getting a bit disappointed. Even if you haven't had that, but maybe you've coached people through it, what would be your advice for
mm.
them?
Well, I've certainly had that experience of
Yeah.
applying for something that I really wanted and then not
Hmm.
getting it. And
Yeah.
there's one job in particular that I always think of, which probably the one I was most disappointed with,
Okay.
quite a few years ago. But it's funny because I normally, when I get knocked back for a job, I normally go through a process over a period of time. So the first stage is normally thinking that interview process was a complete waste of time. They got it really wrong.
Yeah.
Then I start to be a bit more reflective and think, well, actually, maybe I didn't interview well. I didn't project
Mm.
myself. And so I need to improve my interview technique. And then if I'm honest, there's a third stage where I think, well, they probably made the right decision. And actually,
Yeah.
I wasn't the right person for that job. Um, and I suppose there are a couple of bits of advice I'd share. I mean, I think the first thing is, and it's probably fairly obvious, but I think schools are so different in context and in everything. I think it's really important not to be discouraged, because
Mhm.
we can be very strong candidates, but just not be the right fit for
Mhm.
that school at that particular time. And that can depend on so many things that we're not going to know about. It can be on the balance of staff within the school. It can be on situations that aren't going to be there on the job description or the person specification, but which are going to be in the minds of the panel. Um,
Mm,
so just as we might do a fantastic job in presenting ourselves for an interview, but then because we're not the right fit for that one, it doesn't mean to say that we're not the perfect fit for the next job that comes along. So I think being conscious of that and keeping it in mind so as not to be discouraged is
mm,
important. And I think one thing that I've learned relatively recently is that, I mean, I always think it's important to get feedback where possible from an interview process. And I think most schools will do that. I mean, if they're, if somebody's going to the trouble of turning up for interview, taking time off school and everything else, then hopefully a school will at least repay that with some decent feedback.
mm,
But I do see that feedback in a slightly different way now, because I used to think of it in terms of technique and in terms of, again, how you present yourself. And more now, I think it can actually be go a bit deeper than that and be feedback about oneself. And in a way, that corresponds to the 3 stages of the process I was talking about before, that actually it's sometimes not a question just of understanding about how we can be more effective as an interviewee or in an intro exercise or something, but actually what we need to learn
mm.
in our career. Where are the gaps, or even are there things in the way that we not just in the way that we give our answers, because often the way we give our interview answers um, are a window into our thoughts.
Mm.
And I remember one particular interview where um, it dawned on me that I'd actually been not just thinking about how to answer interview questions in a way that wasn't helpful, but actually thinking about the subject of those questions in a way that wasn't helpful. I got into some, cognitive bad habits, if you like.
Mm.
Um, and when I realised that, which was quite a while after the interview, that the penny finally dropped,
Yeah.
it was helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Um, so as we sort of wrap up now, and I really appreciate your time, I think you're probably getting close to all the boys turning up. What would you, whether it's a piece of advice or something that you wish maybe either someone who's wanting to step into middle leadership or someone who's in middle leadership looking to go further, something, advice that you would give them or something that you wish they understood about the journey of becoming a senior leader?
I think many of us have a tendency to underestimate the influence that we have. I mean, I
Mm,
think it's true of parents as well. I think anybody who's involved in forming people, we have an awesome responsibility, but also the amount of influence that we have is, I think, much greater
mm.
than we think. That, as I say, that's certainly a lesson that I've learned, I think, more and more. It makes me quite nervous in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
because, what we do matters a great deal, and the way we
Mm.
do things matters. And, as it's worth keeping that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Well, thank you so much for coming on and being my first guest. I really appreciate your time.
Well, no,
It's
thanks for
been
the
really
invitation.
lovely
Thank
chatting to you.
Very flattered.
Yeah, it's been really great listening and learning from you. I hope everyone who's listened has learnt some things today and taken some things. I'm going to mull over it as we finish. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Benjamin. You too.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.